So we're about to move on to the third question, and I do want to let you know, George, Kevin's offered to maybe have you go first.
I felt bad for you on last one.
So I'll give you a little bit of time to ruminate on that. I think you can get us started if you're willing to do that. You know, I think that what's really apparent to me already is that all of our panelists, and I also recognize some of the folks in this room, there's a lot of amazing activists and organizers in this room who are doing a lot of the same kind of work, a lot of our comrades in this work. That it's really apparent to me from the discussion so far that the answer to the question of what kinds of reforms do we need has come back from each of you, that we need a new political system, or maybe we need to somehow make the existing political system function the way that it's supposed to, right? And what I'll put out, I'll intervene a little bit as a moderator right now. What I'll put out for myself is I think this is one of the reasons why the campaign around the National Guard has taken hold in so many states, because I think there was a recognition that working to influence Congress has been very, very difficult. You know, as George said earlier, you know, Congress really is so far removed from the desires of the American people that the only time that you can really shift them is if, you know, tens of thousands of people in one of their districts votes in a referendum for immediate withdrawal from Iraq. That's something that's happened in a number of states, and we did have several members of Congress from Wisconsin, from our state, that actually shifted their votes immediately after that. But aside from that, they are very insulated. So for the National Guard campaign, and this gets into this last question of how do we get there, it gives us an opportunity to get to members of the United States military, to people who are serving in the National Guard, and to do organizing at the grassroots and at the state level, away from Congress, away from Washington, D.C., and to talk person to person with, again, with members of the military, with veterans, with military families, around something that's real, an actual real structural reform that, for those who don't know, would make it much more difficult for the National Guard to be deployed overseas. Right? The United States military, the Pentagon, has made very clear that they rely on the National Guard for wars of empire. Successive secretaries of defense have said that without the National Guard in Iraq, the occupation would have been impossible. They've said that time and time again, and they're right. So we're trying to make it impossible, and that's what that campaign is about. So I just want to invite you all to check it out, to learn more, not only here, but at bringtheguardhome.org. And also to extend an invitation to all the panelists here and to all of you to a convention that's going to be happening next year, actually almost a little over a year from now, the Democracy Convention, which is bringing together people who are working on democratizing defense, voting rights, media democracy, local democracy, a whole series of different types of pro-democracy initiatives in Madison, Wisconsin. That will be, I think, the first national convention of this time, really of its kind, intended to launch this movement that has been gestating for a while, that's been coming together. So that's a little bit of a plug. And now I'm going to turn it back to George. How do we get there? How do we achieve what we need to achieve here?
Well, you know, I think there's a critical example, and that's this effort that we're here today for. You know, one of my great disappointments was all the different people working on issues who came together during the Obama campaign, you know, and worked hard, did not continue relationships, did not learn from each other. And I don't want to get hung up on that. I'm green and I'm proud of it. But at the same time, as an activist in working on a nonpartisan basis with anyone who will work on the issue, what should have come out of those campaigns didn't happen. You know, in the grassroots, it's critical. That's why social forums such as this, and back home in Wisconsin, we've been doing them for 12 years, and I've been fortunate enough to work on the international level, but getting the grassroots together in this fashion. And for example, in the plenaries, when we can talk about war and militarism and global economic crisis and immigration tonight, that's so important, because then the connections can be made, that conversation can be had in terms of people understanding the other issues and supporting those other issues. How can I talk about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and not talk about access to handguns in Milwaukee, Wisconsin? You know, but when that happens, then the movements grow and they support each other and cross-train, and we have a chance of getting some things done. As we work in our democracy and on the basis of nonviolence in the democratic process, you know, our European allies look at us and say, well, why don't you just turn that shit around? You know, so we got a tough road to go. But that means working in the neighborhoods, working in the cities, and then from that, building that base to influence, and also getting more out of our connections with other movements as we are here. It's all a big mouthful, but within what we've got to work with, that's one of the things that I see as key.
Thank you. David.
Well, there are a lot of areas we can work in, and again, media activism is one of them, education is one of them. We're not going to get anywhere close to what we're dreaming about here while anybody in this room is still alive. We have to educate the people who are going to do it, but, and I think counter-recruitment is key, and it's one where we're seeing victories, where we're shutting down the Army Experience Center, where states are getting the tests out of the schools and so forth. But I think in terms of...
States aren't getting the tests out of the schools.
Maryland is. Your state's
started.
dragging, Susan. But there are, I mean, this is why we need our own communication system, because there are victories. I know they're not enough and they're not everywhere, and there are defeats as well, but we would be telling each other about all the victories all the time if we had a way to do it. And that energizes people. But I think in terms of going after our government in Washington and its policies, the two key points I would make, one is to drop all loyalty to parties, any parties. I think that, you know, we have to minimize elections. Elections are the least of it. We shouldn't have, you know, sane, educated Americans expecting an election to change something, you know, but we should, but the threat of unelecting these people should be one of the tools in our toolbox. And we don't have that threat unless we adopt a willingness to elect somebody even worse in the short run. Because in a winner-take-all system, and you've got these two choices, you're constantly going to your representative and saying, geez, you really disappoint us when you keep doing everything we hate and dumping all our money into these wars, but we're going to try and re-elect you in November because the other guy's from the other party and it's evil. And unless you're willing to say, unless you come to an understanding that evil as the other guy might be, he can't be much more evil. You can't get much more evil than dumping all our resources into wars. Right? You just can't get much worse than that. You get a little worse than that. You get more obnoxious racist comments thrown on top of it, but you can't get much worse than that. So unless you're willing to say, you stop this madness or we will unelect you, not in order to elect somebody worse, but in order to influence them. But then you have to be willing to follow through on the threat. Unless we can do that, we are powerless against these people. And the second point is that what we encourage our representatives to do in Congress should not include all the courtier rhetoric that they like to do, right? When they want to form a new caucus, out of Afghanistan caucus, you know, there's like 11 people and they are all out of Afghanistan. It must be working. No, or they want to do a non-binding, non-specified request for an exit strategy, you know, as if the Senate's going to pass that, as if the President's going to sign that against his will, as if, you know, this agenda, this legislative agenda comes from them. It doesn't come from us. What comes from us is stop paying for the damn wars, which the House alone can do, which people understand, which builds the coalition with the groups that want the money for useful projects. And so, because Congress members think of themselves as court jesters who use rhetoric to influence the president, doesn't mean we have to encourage them in that. We have to encourage them in understanding that they can actually do things, not just say things. When they do things, what they do is they stop spending the money on the wars.
Thank you. Leah.
I think the money part of it might be the avenue to try to reach people. If people feel that war is unjust or immoral or whatever, then they're already on board with trying to stop it or trying to end it. But I think we can make some inroads with people talking about the money issue and what are the missed opportunity costs. What could we have if we didn't have the biggest badass military in the world? What could we have spent that money on? You know, we could, and you all probably know about the Cost of War Project, National Priorities Project, where it gives you trade-offs. My little town of Corvallis, Oregon, our county, our city government this year had to cut $2.4 million from its city budget. And they had a community hearing, and everybody stood up for 2.5 hours. Oh, please don't cut the police department, and don't cut the library, and the senior center, that don't cut that, and don't cut the swimming pool. We really like that. And everybody had, absolutely, I thought they should, all this stuff should be funded, $2.4 million. That's what it costs. Well, they had to make a decision, and they decided to keep the police force the same, but they cut, our library's not going to be closed on Sunday, and our swimming pool hours are shortened, and the developmentally disabled employment program where they, folks tend the gardens, the public gardens downtown, that went away, so that's 6 jobs. So, but for the same price of $2.4 million, we could put 2.4 soldiers in Afghanistan for a year. So how do you want your money spent? And I try to connect the dots with people and say, of course Corvallis, Oregon doesn't directly fund the war, but the residents of our town have spent $100 million plus in tax money on the war. So I would rather have the police department, the fire department, and the Little League. Oh, we cut 2 Little League teams this year too. So if we can relate it to people on their level, would you rather have your National Guard at home doing search and rescue and fighting wildfires and helping out after floods, or would you rather have them in Afghanistan? So if we can relate it to people's little bubble, their little community, their little world, I think as a general rule, Americans are not very globally oriented. They're very concerned about their part of the world and their life, and we are, I think, in general, kind of selfish that way and ignorant about other cultures. The other thing is, until we learn to value other human beings as much as we value ourselves, I don't think there's a whole lot of hope. This is a whole generational thing that we have to educate children from the ground up, that this isn't the best country in the world just because we have the biggest military. We're not the healthiest, we're not the best educated, we're not the most compassionate. We're number 1 in homicides, we're number 1 in military, and is that what we want to be known for? So it's a huge shift, a mind change, a paradigm shift, to use a trade expression, but I think it's going to be very difficult, but it's stuff like this, it's gatherings like this to see thousands of people who are all working on their issue, and they're very compassionate and passionate about their issue, and they are all interrelated. And I think it's very inspiring to see people working on it, and we have to build on each other's enthusiasm and successes where we find them, and realize that we are working for the same kind of goals, that they are interrelated. But we have to be patient too, because it's a huge problem to try to fix.
Thank you.
Well, when you have been an empire for 100 years, and before that you had Manifest Destiny and the Mexican War and the treatment of the Native Americans, you have some long roots of violence and militarism to overcome. And so we have a lot to overcome, and it's not easy to undo it. There are so many families in the United States who have multi-generations of veterans. So many families have lost people in wars, that it's a big mindset to overcome. So we have a lot of work cut out for us, and there's a lot to do. But if I was going to take, in a short talk here, one concept to try to push forward of what we need to do, I would put forward the word independent. Independent. We, as people, need to be politically independent. We need to develop a movement that is independent of the two parties, that will challenge both parties. We need to develop independent media that will put forward our views, the views that are not covered by the corporate media, and will call them to the carpet when they do things like the New York Times recently did with the $1 trillion of wealth under Afghanistan soil, and that story to kind of support the Afghan war. And we need to be independent electorally. I think I'll focus on the independent electoral part, because that's not been discussed much here, and I think that's maybe the most important, and in some ways one of the most difficult. Because even in the progressive left side of things, people still are tied to one of the parties. Despite over and over and over again being disappointed by the Democrats, people stay tied to them. One person this week wrote me a note that described progressive Democrats as the Charlie Brown of American politics. Democrats are loosely holding the ball. We're going to hold the ball for you, Charlie. Come kick it. And as soon as Charlie goes to kick it, they move the ball away. That is the history of how Democrats treat the progressive wing of their party. When will progressives say enough? We're going to do our own thing. And this has been the truth throughout our history. We're not facing something new here. From the beginning of the founding of this country, even before it, there was an abolition movement to end slavery. In 1777, Vermont became the first state to end slavery. And yet, for nearly 100 years after that, up until the Civil War, the issue of slavery, ending slavery, was off the political agenda. Because the two parties colluded with the biggest business of the United States of that day. Slavery, more valuable than all the railroads, all the banks, all the industry. Slavery was the #1 wealth business of the day. The Democrats were plantation owners, profiting directly from slavery. The Whigs were northern industrialists who profited from cheap cotton, and the two colluded to say, we will not discuss abolition. It was off the political agenda. Just like ending corporatism, ending war is off the political agenda today because our politicians from both parties, from Obama down, I don't care if he's black, he's a corrupt corporatist. That's what he is first and foremost. And it's time to face that. Both parties have colluded to take these things off the agenda. What do the abolitionists do? Can you imagine being an abolitionist? My age, 55 years old, fighting your whole life for ending slavery, and you get to the 1840s, they passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and the dreads, allowing plantation owners to go north and say that black is my property, and the judge gets paid more to send that black down back with you in the plantation. He gets paid more for that. Just like our judge in the Gulf, said no to the moratorium because he has stocks and he has money in the oil industry. It's a corrupt system. It's a spoiled system. And what they do after 100 years of advocacy for ending slavery, they recognized they couldn't make progress in electoral unity. They had to make progress in electoral unity. Some of them, decided to form a third party, an abolitionist third party. They never succeeded. They never got more than 10% of the vote in the presidential election. But they destroyed the Whig Party. They destroyed one of the two pro-slavery parties. We had to destroy one of the two corporatist parties. I don't care which one it is. We have to destroy one of the two corporatist parties. Until there's a non-corporatist party, we're not going to make the progress we need to make. They destroyed one of the corporatist party, the Whigs, replaced by the Republicans. Lincoln came in as the most successful third-party president in history. And he came in on a weak platform on slavery, but in the end he ended slavery. And this is not the only time it's occurred in our history. In other times in our history, whether it's farmers being foreclosed on, whether it's workers being treated unfairly, whether it's the 40-hour work week, whether it's child labor, whether it's prohibition of alcohol, whether it's civil rights issues, whether it's Social Security, taking care of the people who are elderly, whether it's taking care of people who are poor and sick, whatever the issue is, the electoral genesis of all those issues came from outside of the two parties that were in power. Because the two parties have always stood for the status quo. I don't care whether it's Clinton saying hope and change or Obama saying change and hope. The reality is the two parties always stand for the status quo. So one of the greatest enemies we have currently are progressive Democrats who think they can change this party. Unions joined this party in the 1930s thinking they could change this party. They didn't change the party, they changed the unions. The women's movement, the civil rights movement. They thought they could change the party, they joined their party. They didn't change the party, they destroyed their movements. The women's rights movement is going nowhere. Women's equality is going nowhere. We still have racism despite a black president. We're not making the progress. Union rights are getting weaker. Join the Democratic Party, you lose your movement. The Progressive Democrats of America need to drop that middle word from their organization. Progressives of America. That's what we need. Forget the Democratic Party, folks. Independent is the one word you got to talk about. Now, I'm not going to say we're going to win elections right away. Of course not. I'm not saying only one for president. Of course not. We got to start locally, we got to build, we got to make this happen independently. And an independent political movement needs to be tied to an electoral movement. These are you know, two wings of a bird. And they have to help each other to move forward. But until we can convince progressives to get rid of that word Democrat and face up to the reality that the Democratic Party is the war party. What president's not a war president for the Democratic Party? You can go back through all of them. And the reality in the end is, it's not the politicians who win these things. The electoral vehicle is not the goal just necessarily to win elections. It's to impact the political dialogue. It's to build the movement. Because it was not Woodrow Wilson who gave women the right to vote. Woodrow Wilson locked women up and tortured them to prevent them from getting the right to vote. It was not LBJ who brought civil rights. His party was made up of segregationists who opposed civil rights. It was not Nixon who ended the Vietnam War. It was independent movements who stood up against the politicians. The politicians like to lead the parade. It's our job to create the parade. So independent is the word that you have to keep in mind always. Independent of these two parties, independent of these corporate powers, independent of this corporate media. Independent political movement is what will win this for us in the end. That's what we have to build. And at votersforpeace.us, that's our focus, is building a movement. Our pledge on votersforpeace.us, I will not vote for any politician who supports wars of aggression. All it means is we're voting for people who just obey international law. That's all it means. It's not a big radical concept. We just say obey international law. So we need an independent political movement, and that drives through not just movement, but elections and communication in the media as well.
So, I can see that we're going to have some discussion here, which I'm actually looking forward to. And I also see a gentleman here who's ready to start the discussion as well. So this is really good, and actually we have plenty of time, much more time than I had hoped for. So I'm very happy with that too. I want to say a few things, if that's all right. Which is just that I was active with the Democratic Party for a long time, for 10 years. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and had opportunities to get involved with liberal politics there early on. And it was the Persian Gulf War that radicalized me. It was kids that I went to high school who were sent over there, who were in the National Guard, who were sent in the first time that you saw major deployments and any kind of offensive capacity. The National Guard was used in World War II, but not in the same way as in the Persian Gulf War. And I also was very involved in the anti-war movement at that time. And one thing that I saw happen in the years after the United States actually withdrew from Iraq, which I sometimes think we forget about, and just carried on the bombing from above, was that the anti-war movement really started to focus on structural reforms. It subsided. We didn't have the thousands of people out in the streets anymore, banging on doors, doing sit-ins, getting arrested, and so on. And now, as I've had more time and experience and also a chance to look at history, I've found that has happened throughout American history. When Leah was talking earlier about the Ludlow Amendment, which came within 13 votes in Congress of getting passed on to the states, it was an amendment to give the people the referendum power to determine whether or not the United States went to war, right? That came out of the aftermath of opposition to World War I, right? It was a 20-year struggle that was very nearly successful to amend the Constitution to give the American people the deciding power. When we're talking about the abolitionist movement, I think all of us will remember that the opposition to the Mexican-American War, to the United States invading Mexico, supporting the Texas secessionists, was very strong in northern states, in the so-called free states. And it was those people who were in the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party who founded the Republican Party, again in Ripon, Wisconsin, March 13th, 1854, who also had a strategy that involved the militia, i.e. the National Guard. They formed northern militia units, okay? Because they said the United States military is in the service of the slave power, and we cannot allow the federal government to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in northern states. And so they had, by some estimates, up to 200,000 men training in Republican militias to get ready, to make it impossible. In fact, I shouldn't even say to get ready. They made it impossible to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 in various northern states, right? So there is an interplay that has played out over and over again throughout American history, and I'll say sometimes our forebears have even been successful. right? I mean, there was not another war in which the United States actually invaded and militarily occupied another country for 50 years. That's actually a fairly long period in American history, right? It wasn't until the Spanish-American War. So I'm reminded of those things, and I just want to suggest that it may not be either a strategy that has to involve just electoral politics or independent politics or voting rights and election reforms or media reform, but that there is a component to democratizing defense that we also need to not sort of let go of here, to seeing that we actually need to do more work in this area of developing a strategy around the United States military. And so I'm hopeful that some of that will come out of this discussion too. I can see that David wanted to respond there, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to do that, and then we'll open it up.
Well, I did finally disagree with something, but Kevin said it, not you.
Now you know why you wanted to go last, huh?
Well, as someone who, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin is on the board of Voters for Peace as well as the board of Progressive Democrats of America, and somehow keeps these enemies in my head. I agree 1,000% with the pledge that Kevin cited. I will vote against, I will work against anyone who funds these wars. But there's no parties mentioned there. And a handful of people who do vote against the wars, most of them are Democrats. And some of them are Republicans, and there's one or two possible independents, and that's it. And so if the mission is to destroy one of the two parties, then you begin to think, well, let's pick which party we're going to destroy and vote against anyone who's a member of that party, and that's a little bit different strategy from I'm going to vote against anyone who funds these wars. My ideal would actually be to minimize the power of any party, so that rather than have these two parties and shifting to having one of them and a new one, we minimize the power that any party has, so that an independent representative can actually represent their constituents rather than the president of any party. And that's a different ideal to have in mind, and involves different reforms. Some of the reforms that we've already talked about and all agree on. But to say that our enemy is the progressive Democrats, as if Dennis Kucinich is more sinister than Dick Cheney because he's selling us some false front, I think is to get a little bit off track. It's not to say that Dennis Kucinich is perfect, or it's not to say that Dennis Kucinich doesn't, make his party look better than 85% of it is, and so forth. But is to say if we're going to work for peace and justice, and we're going to work outside of loyalties to parties, then our loyalty can't 100% be animosity toward a particular party. It has to be animosity toward war and injustice. And I think if you take all of the groups that work at all on the progressive side of things in Washington, some of the groups that are the least subservient to the Democratic Party, for whatever weird reason, are the groups that have that word Democrat in their name, that big capital D Democrat. Democrats.com, Progressive Democrats of America, these are both groups that I work with, are the least likely of any liberal groups in DC to obey what the Democratic Party tells them to do. You had every single labor union, every single so-called progressive think tank out there fighting against single-payer health care. And you had Progressive Democrats of America and Democrats.com saying, screw you, this is what our members want, and we're going to listen to our members. We're not going to take our orders from Nancy or from some union president in DC. And so to get hung up on the name rather than the substance, and to say, let's have a battle between organizations, among the few organizations we've got that are anywhere near the agenda that we're talking about here. I work with organizations that are communist, and I'm not communist. I work with organizations that are veterans, and I would never be a veteran. But you work with organizations that agree with you even on one issue. I work with libertarians who oppose wars, and they only oppose wars because they cost money. But I work with, so to say, as you have, Kevin, and I say this with deep respect for someone who does more work night and day for peace and justice than anybody else I can think of, but you've refused to support something where you agreed with 99% of it, but it mentioned Progressive Democrats of America. I mean, it's good to be principled, but we have to have the right principles, I think.
So let me ask our other two panelists, do you want to jump in on this, or should we throw it open? And I'd certainly give you the opportunity to, or do you have any closing thoughts?
Not me.
We'll throw it open. Okay. Thank you.